The avoidant is sitting alone in the silence they claimed they needed, and it's suffocating them. They're replaying every interaction they had with you, but this time they're seeing it differently. They're seeing it from your perspective, and what they see is devastating. The casual dismissiveness that felt like self-protection now looks like cruelty. The emotional unavailability that seemed like healthy boundaries now appears as rejection. The hot and cold pattern that helped them manage their fear now reveals itself as torture they inflicted on someone who only wanted consistency. They're finally understanding what it felt like to be on the receiving end of their behavior, and the realization is hitting them with a force that's dismantling everything they told themselves about who they are and how they treat people. For months, maybe years, the avoidant operated from a specific narrative about the relationship. They told themselves they were just being honest about their limitations. They convinced themselves they never promised anything they didn't deliver. They believed they were clear about needing space, and that you chose to stay despite knowing what they could offer. This narrative allowed them to behave in ways that hurt you without having to feel guilt or responsibility. They weren't the bad guy in their own story. They were just someone protecting themselves, maintaining boundaries, being realistic about what they wanted. You were the one who expected too much, who wanted what they couldn't give, who didn't respect their need for independence. But something has shifted. Maybe you finally left, and the permanence of your absence is forcing them to confront what they lost. Maybe enough time has passed that their defensive narratives are crumbling under the weight of reality. Maybe they've seen you with someone else and watched you receive the treatment they never gave you. Maybe they've simply had enough distance to see clearly what they couldn't see when they were in the midst of protecting themselves. Whatever triggered it, the avoidant is now experiencing something they've avoided their entire relational life. Genuine remorse for how they treated someone who cared about them. The replay of their cruelty. The avoidant's mind has become a torture chamber of memories that won't stop playing. Every moment they were cold when you wanted warmth. Every time they dismissed your feelings as too much or too intense. Every occasion they made you feel stupid for wanting basic relationship things like consistency or communication. Every instance they pulled away right after you'd been vulnerable, punishing you for the very openness they claimed to want. All of it is replaying in vivid detail, but now the avoidant is experiencing these memories with new awareness of what they actually meant to you. They remember the time you asked where the relationship was going, and they responded with irritation, making you feel foolish for wanting clarity. They see now that you weren't being demanding, you were being reasonable, you were asking for what anyone would ask for after months of seeing someone. But they made you feel like you were being needy, like you were pressuring them, like you were the problem for wanting what humans naturally want in connection. They see the hurt in your face in that memory, hurt they dismissed at the time as manipulation or emotional excess. Now they recognize it as legitimate pain they caused. They remember all the times you reached for them emotionally and they pulled away. The nights you tried to have meaningful conversation and they deflected with jokes or changed the subject. The moments you were going through something difficult and they offered logic instead of comfort, solutions instead of presence. They thought they were helping. They thought their rational approach was useful. They didn't understand that you didn't need fixing. You needed to be held emotionally, and they refused to hold you because holding meant staying in emotional intensity they couldn't tolerate. The avoidant replays the pattern of their inconsistency and sees it now as the crazy-making behavior it was. They were warm and available one week, making you feel close and connected. Then they disappeared the next week without explanation, leaving you confused and anxious. Then they came back acting like nothing happened, annoyed if you expressed hurt about their absence. They put you through this cycle repeatedly, and each time they told themselves it was your fault for not understanding their need for space. Now they see it was their responsibility to communicate, to be consistent, to either commit or let you go instead of keeping you in this torturous limbo. They remember specific cruel things they said, things they justified at the time as honesty or as necessary to maintain their boundaries. They told you they weren't sure how they felt about you when they were actually falling for you and terrified of it. They said you were too emotional when you were being normally human. They accused you of being clingy when you were asking for reasonable time and attention. They questioned whether you were right for them when the real question was whether they were capable of being right for anyone. Every cutting remark, every dismissive comment, every moment they made you feel small, it's all coming back with the belated recognition that words cause wounds that don't heal easily, the recognition of your patience. What's hitting the avoidant particularly hard is the recognition of how patient you were with them. You tolerated behavior that you shouldn't have tolerated. You made excuses for them when you should have held them accountable. You gave them chance after chance to do better, to show up consistently, to treat you with the care you deserved. And they took that patience for granted. They interpreted your willingness to stay as evidence that their behavior was acceptable, rather than as evidence of your remarkable capacity to love someone through their dysfunction. The avoidant is seeing now how many times you tried to communicate your needs clearly and kindly. You didn't start out angry or demanding. You started out vulnerable, explaining what would help you feel secure, asking for things that were completely reasonable. And they responded to your vulnerability with defensiveness. They made you feel like you were asking for too much when you were actually asking for the bare minimum. They positioned themselves as the victim of your needs when they were actually just being asked to participate in basic relationship reciprocity. They're recognizing all the ways you accommodated their fear. You gave them space when they needed it, even when it hurt you. You didn't pressure them for labels or definitions when you wanted those things. You accepted their limitations and worked within them, hoping that patience would eventually help them feel safe enough to open up. You did emotional labor they never acknowledged, managing your own anxiety so they wouldn't feel pressured, suppressing your own needs so they wouldn't feel overwhelmed. You bent yourself into uncomfortable shapes to make room for their avoidance, and they never thanked you. They never even noticed. The avoidant remembers all the times you stayed when you could have left, when they were cold and distant, when they disappeared without explanation, when they hurt you through their inconsistency. You had every reason to walk away, every justification to decide they weren't worth the pain. But you stayed. You stayed because you saw something in them worth fighting for, because you believed in their potential, because you loved them despite their fear. And they repaid that loyalty with more of the same treatment, never improving, never growing, never becoming worthy of the grace you extended. They're also seeing how you tried to understand them. You read about avoidant attachment. You tried to learn what they needed. You asked questions to understand their perspective. You didn't just dismiss them as broken or damaged. You tried to work with their psychology, to create safety for them, to help them feel comfortable enough to let you in. You put in effort to understand them that they never reciprocated. They never tried to understand your attachment style, your needs, your fears. They expected you to do all the work of bridging the gap between you while they remained protected behind their walls. The shame of their selfishness. The avoidant is being crushed under the weight of recognizing how profoundly selfish they were. They made everything about their needs, their fears, their comfort. The relationship existed entirely on their terms. They decided when you were close and when you were distant. They determined what pace felt safe and expected you to accept it. They controlled every aspect of the dynamic to protect themselves, never considering what it cost you to live in constant uncertainty and emotional scarcity. They see now that they treated you like an option while you treated them like a priority. You made time for them consistently. You showed up when you said you would. You were reliable and present in ways they never reciprocated. Meanwhile, they fit you in when it was convenient, cancelled when something better came along, disappeared when intimacy felt too intense. They kept you perpetually unsure of where you stood, while enjoying the security of knowing exactly how you felt about them. The asymmetry was profound, and they maintained it deliberately to preserve their own sense of control. The avoidant is recognizing that they took without giving. They took your emotional support when they needed it, but weren't available when you needed them. They took your understanding of their limitations without trying to stretch beyond those limitations. They took your patience without working to become someone worthy of that patience. They extracted everything valuable you offered while giving back the bare minimum, and they convinced themselves this was fair because they'd been honest about their emotional unavailability. They're seeing the double standards they applied. When they needed space, you were expected to give it without question or complaint. But when you needed closeness, they treated it as an imposition. When they had a bad day, you were supposed to be understanding and accommodating. But when you had a bad day, they were often annoyed or dismissive. When they were inconsistent, You were supposed to accept it as part of who they are. But when you expressed any needs that felt inconsistent or challenging, they positioned you as demanding or difficult. The shame also comes from recognizing that they knew what they were doing. On some level, they were aware they were hurting you. They saw your pain when they pulled away. They noticed your confusion when they were hot and cold. They recognized your hurt when they were dismissive. But they minimized it, telling themselves you were overreacting or being too sensitive. They prioritized protecting themselves over preventing your pain, and that choice, repeated over and over, reveals a selfishness they can no longer deny or justify. The avoidant is also confronting the ways they blamed you for their own behavior. When they withdrew, they told themselves it was because you were too clingy. When they were cold, they decided it was because you were too emotional. When they couldn't commit, they convinced themselves it was because you weren't quite right for them. They externalized all responsibility, making you the problem when the problem was their own fear and their unwillingness to face it. This blame shifting protected their ego, but destroyed your self-esteem, and recognizing that now fills them with shame they can barely tolerate. The loss of your idealization. One of the cruelest realizations hitting the avoidant is understanding that they had you on a pedestal in their mind while treating you terribly in reality. In their private thoughts, you were perfect. You were beautiful, intelligent, understanding, patient, everything they could want in a partner. They thought about you constantly. They compared everyone else to you and found them lacking. You occupied their mind in ways they never let you occupy their life. They idealized you internally while rejecting you externally, creating a devastating split between how they felt and how they behaved. The avoidant is seeing now that they loved you, maybe deeply, but they loved you primarily in fantasy. In their imagination, you could be together without any of the vulnerability that real togetherness requires. In their mind, they could have closeness without risk, intimacy without fear, love without the possibility of loss. Fantasy. You were safe because fantasy, you couldn't actually hurt them. But real you, the person standing in front of them, wanting actual relationship, triggered every defense mechanism they had. So they kept you at distance in reality while cherishing you in imagination, never understanding how cruel that split was. They're recognizing that their idealization of you was actually a form of objectification. They didn't see you as a full person with needs and feelings that deserved consideration. They saw you as a source of good feelings when they wanted those feelings, and as a threat to their autonomy when intimacy felt too intense. They used you to meet their needs for connection while refusing to meet your needs for consistency and commitment. They wanted you to be available when they needed you, but understanding when they needed to disappear, that's not love, that's using someone. The loss they're feeling now is complicated because what they lost wasn't just you. They lost the fantasy version of you they've been carrying. They lost the possibility of ever actualizing the relationship they imagined, but never allowed to exist. They lost the future they sometimes envisioned where somehow, magically, they'd be brave enough to choose you fully. All of it is gone now, not because it was taken from them, but because they destroyed it through their own fear and their refusal to translate feeling into action. The avoidant is also confronting the reality that someone else will get the version of you they never let themselves have. Someone else will receive your patience and understanding and use it as the gift it was meant to be. Someone else will appreciate your willingness to work with their limitations instead of exploiting it. Someone else will meet you halfway, will show up consistently, will earn the love you tried to give the avoidant. And that person will get to experience the full beauty of partnership with you, while the avoidant is left with memories of how they wasted the chance they had. The regret that transforms everything. The regret the avoidant is experiencing isn't simple or clean. It's not just, I wish I'd done that differently. It's comprehensive regret that touches every aspect of who they are and how they relate to people. They're regretting specific behaviors, yes, but they're also regretting the entire approach they've taken to relationships throughout their life. They're seeing that the way they treated you is the way they've treated everyone, and the pattern is finally visible to them in all its destructive clarity. They regret every time they chose fear over love, every moment they picked safety over risk, every instance they valued control more than connection. They had opportunities to be brave, to be vulnerable, to choose you despite their fear, and every single time, They chose protection. They chose the familiar discomfort of loneliness over the unfamiliar discomfort of intimacy. They chose the certainty of distance over the uncertainty of closeness. And now they're seeing that those choices, repeated over time, didn't keep them safe. They just kept them alone. The avoidant regrets not communicating what was really happening for them. You deserve to know that their withdrawal wasn't about you. You deserve to understand that their coldness was fear, not indifference. You deserve transparency about their internal struggle. But they couldn't give you that transparency because it would have required vulnerability they weren't capable of. So you were left to interpret their behavior, and you naturally interpreted it as rejection, as lack of care, as evidence you weren't enough. They let you carry that misinterpretation because explaining the truth would have meant exposing themselves. They regret not fighting for you, for the relationship, for the possibility of something real between you. They let you walk away, or they pushed you away without ever really trying. They never said, "I'm scared but I want this." They never said, "I need help working through my fear." They never said, "Don't give up on me, I'm trying to be braver." They just let it end, passively or actively destroying something precious, because holding on to it would have required more courage than they could access. And now they see that letting go wasn't protection. It was loss. It was giving up the best thing they'd ever had, because keeping it would have meant facing themselves. The regret is also forcing the avoidant to confront what they've lost beyond just you. They've lost the opportunity to be the kind of partner they actually wanted to be. They've lost the chance to prove to themselves that they're capable of sustained intimacy. They've lost time they'll never get back, time they spent running instead of growing. They've lost the version of themselves they could have become if they'd been brave enough to do the work while you were still there supporting them. All of these losses are accumulating into grief so heavy they don't know how to carry it. The futile desire to undo. The avoidant is consumed by desperate, futile fantasies about undoing the past. They imagine going back and doing everything differently. They picture themselves being warm when they were cold. They envision themselves showing up consistently instead of disappearing. They fantasize about being vulnerable instead of defended. In these imagined scenarios, they're the partner you deserved from the beginning, and the relationship flourishes instead of dying slowly under the weight of their fear. These fantasies are torture because they highlight everything the avoidant now understands they were capable of but didn't access. The capacity to be different was always there. The ability to choose differently existed. They weren't actually incapable of consistency or vulnerability or communication. They were just too afraid. And recognizing that the barrier was fear rather than inability makes the regret more painful because it means the loss was preventable. They could have had something beautiful with you if they'd been braver. The avoidant wants to reach out, to apologize, to explain, to try to fix what they broke. They compose long messages in their mind, detailing everything they now understand. They rehearse conversations where they finally articulate what they were feeling back then. They imagine showing up at your door and telling you they've changed, they've grown. They finally see everything clearly. But they stop themselves, paralyzed by the knowledge that it's too late, that they destroyed something that can't be rebuilt, that you've moved on emotionally from someone who hurt you too many times. There's also the painful recognition that even if you did give them another chance, they might repeat the same patterns. The fear hasn't magically disappeared. The attachment wounding is still there. The triggers that caused them to pull away would likely trigger them again. Unless they've done serious therapeutic work to address their core issues, they'd probably just hurt you again, maybe even worse because you'd be entering a second chance with hope that they'd destroy again. This recognition adds another layer to their regret because it means wanting you back isn't enough. They need to become someone different, someone capable of sustaining intimacy, and that transformation takes time they didn't invest while you were present, the transformation or stagnation fork. The way the avoidant treated you is hitting them hard, and they're standing at a critical juncture. This recognition, this regret, this painful awareness of their patterns can go one of two ways. It can become the catalyst that finally motivates genuine change, or it can become another weight they carry while continuing to repeat the same patterns with the next person. The pain they're feeling right now is intense enough to drive transformation if they're willing to use it that way. But it's also intense enough that they might eventually suppress it, minimize it, return to their defensive narratives to escape the discomfort of self-examination. If the avoidant chooses transformation, this moment becomes a turning point. They take the regret and let it fuel commitment to therapy, to reading about attachment, to actually doing the deep work of understanding where their patterns came from and how to develop different ones. They stop making excuses and start making changes. They examine their childhood experiences and how those experiences created their fear of intimacy. They practice vulnerability in small, manageable doses with safe people. They learn to recognize when they're deactivating and make different choices. They develop capacity for distress tolerance so that relationship anxiety doesn't immediately trigger flight responses. This transformative path means the avoidant has to grieve not just losing you, but losing the identity they've carried their whole life. They have to stop seeing themselves as the person who doesn't need anyone and start becoming the person who can admit need without shame. They have to stop priding themselves on emotional independence and start valuing healthy interdependence. They have to rewrite their entire narrative about who they are and what they're capable of. It's brutal work, humbling and painful, but it's the only path to being able to have genuine intimacy in the future. But if the avoidant chooses stagnation, they'll eventually minimize what they're feeling now. The acute pain will fade, and as it does, the defensive narratives will reassert themselves. They'll start telling themselves that maybe the relationship wasn't that great anyway, that maybe you weren't that compatible, that maybe they were right to protect themselves because relationships are too complicated. They'll rewrite history to make themselves feel better, to ease the shame, to return to the comfortable but lonely space where their avoidance feels justified rather than destructive. The stagnant avoidant will carry you as a ghost, a what if, a person they think about sometimes with vague regret, but never with enough discomfort to change. They'll date other people and repeat similar patterns, always wondering why relationships don't work out, never quite connecting their behavior to the outcomes. They'll tell themselves they're just not the relationship type, that they're better off alone, that they haven't met the right person. They'll never acknowledge that the problem isn't the people they date, but their inability to sustain vulnerability with anyone. The wake-up call you became. Whether the avoidant transforms or stagnates, the way they treated you and how hard it's hitting them now has changed them permanently. They'll never be quite the same person they were before you. You became the wake-up call they didn't know they needed, the mirror that showed them their patterns clearly, the catalyst that forced recognition they've avoided their entire life. Even if they don't do the work to change, they'll carry the knowledge of what their avoidance costs. They'll remember you as the person they lost because they weren't brave enough, the relationship they destroyed because they valued fear over love, the chance they had for something real that they let slip away. For you, whether they change or not doesn't change what you deserved and didn't receive. Their regret, however genuine, doesn't erase the pain they caused. Their recognition of how they treated you doesn't undo the damage to your self-esteem or the months or years you spent confused and hurting. Their transformation, if it happens, will benefit their future partners, but doesn't retroactively heal the wounds they inflicted on you. And their stagnation, if that's what they choose, is simply confirmation that walking away was the right decision for your well-being. The way they treated you is hitting them hard now, and they're drowning in regret. But regret alone changes nothing. Only sustained action toward genuine transformation matters. Only willingness to face the fear that drove their hurtful behavior creates possibility for different outcomes. Only commitment to becoming someone capable of the vulnerability that intimacy requires makes their remorse meaningful. Without those things, they're just another avoidant feeling temporarily bad about their patterns before returning to repeat them, carrying you as a painful memory, but not as the teacher you could have been if they'd been brave enough to learn the lessons while you were still there offering them.